Carlsen and Garry Kasparov. The two legends of chess played two games against each other in a tournament. Magnus was just 13 years old while Garry destroyed all of his opponents of that time. So, hello all, welcome back to Chess Nerds. Here we analyze previous historic games so that you can improve your own game by learning through it. So, without wasting your time, let's just directly look at this game. Magnus is playing with white pieces and Garry with the black pieces. The fun fact is that Garry pulled a Magnus move in this game. He arrived late to this game just like what Magnus does nowadays. So Magnus starts with Queen's Gambit.
Yeah, boy.
And Garry goes for Slav Defense, which is a strong counter to Queen's Gambit but very rarely played. Magnus develops his knight and Garry does the same. Now why Slav Defense is very rarely played is that here lies the problem. The light square bishop can't be developed easily. It will take some moves before you develop it. Garry pins the knight with queen, which is also very rare as black usually develops his bishop pinning the knight. Now Magnus plays knight d2, a very strong move as it stops the knight jumping to e4 as it is not pinned anymore. Garry adds more pressure. Magnus just brings out his queen. Garry plays pawn e5 to break open the center. Magnus castles and Garry takes the pawn. Now the advantage of playing knight d2 is that Magnus can play knight b3, kicking away the queen and holding the center. We see a5 and Magnus goes a4 so that knight isn't kicked away. Garry decides to attack the h2 pawn as knight is not guarding that pawn anymore. Obviously Magnus plays h3. Here Garry goes knight b6, which is kind of a mistake as it was guarding the knight on f6. And Magnus obviously spots it and he tries to open up the king. Now Garry can't take the bishop as there will be a queen g6 check. Magnus will eat all the pawns with checks, opening up the king. So Garry takes the light square bishop. Now Magnus spots another great move. Instead of moving the bishop away, he plays knight e4, attacking the knight. If Garry takes the bishop, it will be a forced mate with knight check, queen h6 check, and ending the game with pawn checkmate. But obviously, Garry is a GM and we are just average players. Garry plays bishop check, making space for knight. Here Garry was not at all happy with his position. Magnus takes the bishop. Garry takes the knight with discovered attack. Magnus plays best move again, bishop e5, attacking the queen and knight. The knight has to come back. Now this is a position where Magnus is dominating the game as black pieces are yet to develop, but Magnus can go for an attack with knight and rook and also queen. Magnus immediately strikes with queen c5, then he attacks the pawn. Garry just removes the pin. Magnus adds more pressure, but we just see the some traits here. Garry starts to counterattack and suddenly Garry is doing fine. He can develop his bishop, connecting the rooks, then attacking the knight and bishop at the same time. Magnus just couldn't convert the game into the win. Garry threatens the mate, so we see the queen trade here. And then we see some obvious moves. There is no win for Magnus here anymore. He may be up a pawn, but we have opposite colored bishop on board, which is just a draw, as you can't predict the pawn with dark square bishop when the pawn goes on light square. This game ends up in a draw, but everyone was shocked by the result, as how could a 13-year-old boy draw a game against Garry the legend?
A draw. It's a sensation. Magnus managed to draw against Kasparov. Kasparov couldn't beat Magnus.
Now then comes the second game where Garry is dead serious and he is playing with white pieces while Magnus is playing with the black pieces. We see the English opening here. Garry goes e4 trying to kick away the knight, and then Garry goes d4 holding a very strong center. Magnus goes for King's Indian defense, which is quite funny as King's Indian defense is a favorite opening of Garry. Here there are a lot of variations. White can play d5 to hold the strong center, but Garry goes for bishop e3. Magnus plays c6 to hold the center strongly here. Then Magnus attacks the center to go for an attack on king, preventing Garry to castle. But Garry here plays a very good move, pawn to c5, as it can be protected with bishop and also pawn b4, leaving Magnus with the isolated pawn where the major attack will take place. We see the castle removing king from the threat. Magnus tries to add more pressure on knight and then he goes for the attack on h2 pawn. Garry defends it and Magnus strikes the rook. But now Magnus plays a very weird move, knight to g7. Knight can't protect the dark squares around the king, making it a very big weakness for the king. Garry prepares for the attack on isolated pawn. We see some good moves here, and here Garry plays knight d6, which seems weird, but it is a very strong move. Why? Because now you can't take the pawn, as knight will take it and queen can go to h6 and create a threat of bishop coming into the attack. So Magnus tries to counter attack, but Garry goes knight e4, another amazing move. Bishop attacks the knight, but Garry yet again plays another brilliant move, pawn to d7. Now queen can't take the pawn as there will be a triple grand 4. So bishop takes it and we see some trades here. Magnus can't play bishop f5 as there will be a 4. So Magnus goes knight f5 attacking the queen, but that just loses a bishop. Magnus attacks the queen and queen goes back and we see some normal moves here. Magnus goes for queen trade here, but that's it. Magnus has no attack left. He is down a material in the endgame, so he just resigns here. Magnus was very close to beat Garry, but he couldn't. And yet everyone was impressed by Magnus for the way he played against Garry the legend. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to click like, share and subscribe button. If you want to look at any other historic games, do comment down and I will check it out. So bye.